There is a version of Rick and Morty that most people think they have watched. A drunk genius drags his nervous grandson across the multiverse. The family is dysfunctional. The adventures are insane. The comedy is dark and the science is fake. And somewhere underneath all of it, there are feelings that nobody on screen is willing to talk about directly. That version is real, but it is sitting on top of another version entirely. A version built from secrets that the show planted across 7 seasons and never announced. Secrets about who these people actually are, where they actually came from, and what the show has been quietly arguing about all of them from the very beginning. Some of these secrets are hidden in plain sight. Some of them were buried in episodes that aired years before they were relevant. Some of them were confirmed by the show's own creators and then never spoken of again. All of them change what you thought you were watching. This is 2 hours of Rick and Morty lore, but it is not about the multiverse or the aliens or the portal gun. It is about the people. Welcome to Ricktopus. If this is your first time here, subscribing is completely free, and it is the main reason videos like this one get made. Now let's get into it. Rick C137 was never supposed to be this Rick. There is a moment in the season 5 finale where Rick hands Morty a small device and tells him to press play. What comes out is not an explanation. It is a memory. And what that memory shows, quietly, without any dramatic music swelling underneath it, completely changes everything you thought you understood about who Rick Sanchez is, why he drinks the way he does, and why he showed up at that house in the first place. Most people who watch Rick and Morty assume they are watching a show about a genius grandfather and his real family. They assume that when Rick sits at the dinner table with Beth and Jerry and Summer and Morty, he belongs there, that these are his people, that this is his home. None of that is true. The Rick in this show, the one you have watched for 7 seasons, the one who burps mid-sentence and builds robots and turns himself into a pickle, is not the Rick who originally belonged to this family. He is Rick C137. He comes from a completely different dimension, and the reason he ended up in that house, at that table, calling that woman his daughter and that boy his grandson, is one of the most quietly devastating pieces of storytelling the show has ever attempted. Here is what actually happened. Rick C137, the man we follow throughout the entire series, was once a different kind of person. Not softer exactly, but present. He had a wife named Diane. He had a daughter named Beth. He had a life that was, by any measure, a real one. Rooted, specific, chosen. The show does not spend a lot of time in this version of Rick because it does not need to. What matters is that he had something worth losing. Then another Rick showed up. This other Rick, who the show eventually names Rick Prime, had figured out how to travel between dimensions before anyone else. He arrived in Rick C137's garage one day with the portal gun, with the science, with the whole pitch. Come with me. Explore the multiverse. There are infinite universes out there, and you could see all of them. Rick C137 said no. He looked at the technology and the promise of everything the cosmos had to offer, and he said no, because he had Diane, and he had Beth, and that felt like enough. Rick Prime did not take that well. He came back, and this time, he did not come with an offer. He planted a bomb. The bomb killed Diane. It killed Beth. Rick C137's original daughter died when she was still a child. His wife died on the same day, and the man who did it was, technically, him. Another version of himself from another dimension, wearing the same face, carrying the same name. What that does to a person is not something the show explains in any direct way. It shows it instead. Rick C137 spent the years that followed building his own portal gun, teaching himself everything he needed to know, and then moving through the multiverse hunting the Rick who destroyed his family. Not for justice, not to prevent something worse, just to find him, just to make it stop. He killed other versions of Rick along the way, not because those Ricks were guilty, but because he was looking for one specific Rick among infinite versions of the same face. The show confirms he killed enormous numbers of his own variants during this search. He did not stop. He did not slow down. He kept going until the other Ricks, collectively, had lost enough of themselves that they negotiated a kind of peace. That negotiation eventually became the Citadel of Ricks, the interdimensional city full of Rick and Morty variants that the show visits in later seasons. Rick C137 helped build it. He oversaw its construction, and then he walked away from it too. Because Rick C137 has never been able to stay in anything he built. What he did next is the part most people have not fully processed even after seeing it. He traveled to Rick Prime's original home dimension, the dimension where Rick Prime came from, the dimension where Rick Prime had a daughter named Beth, and a grandson named Morty, and a son-in-law named Jerry, and had simply left them, because he did not care about any of them enough to stay. Rick C137 settled there, in Rick Prime's dimension. In Rick Rick Prime's house with Rick Prime's family. His plan, if you can call it that, was to wait. Rick Prime would come back to his original dimension eventually, and when he did, Rick C137 would be there. Rick Prime never came back, and something happened that Rick C137 did not plan for. He started to love them. Not in the simple, uncomplicated way people love their actual families. In the way someone loves a thing they know they have no real claim to. Morty Prime is not his grandson. Beth C131 is not his daughter. The Smith family he lives with are not his family in any biological or dimensional sense. They belong to another Rick entirely. A Rick who abandoned them without a second thought and has never returned because he simply does not feel whatever it is that would make him want to. Rick C137 stayed anyway. This is the secret that the show keeps in its back pocket for 5 complete seasons before it lays it out in full. Every moment in seasons 1 through 4 where Rick seems to push Morty away and then pull him back. Every scene where he performs indifference but acts like someone who cares. Every time he saves a family he publicly insists he does not need. All of it is Rick C137 trying to navigate an attachment he did not choose and cannot seem to abandon. There is a specific weight to the season 3 premiere that reads completely differently once you know all of this. Rick, locked in a Federation prison, fabricates a fake origin story to feed to his interrogators. A memory of Rick Prime showing up in his garage, of the bomb, of Diane and Beth dying. The interrogators use it against him, but the memory, it turns out, was not entirely fake. The season 5 finale confirms that the core of what Rick showed them was true. The bomb was real. The deaths were real. The man in the white coat was real. Rick used his truest wound as a weapon because he knew that even the truth, delivered on his terms, could be made into a trap. That is the kind of person you become after what happened to Rick C137. The Beth he lives with has no idea that her real father, Rick Prime, destroyed a family in another dimension and then disappeared. She knows only that her father left and came back, and she has spent her entire adult life trying to hold on to a man she thinks is hers, but who is, technically, a replacement. Not a fraud, exactly. Someone who chose to stay where someone else chose to leave. But the family does not know that. The show confirmed in Season 6, through the fate of Beth Prime, the Beth who actually belonged to Rick C137's replacement dimension, that those people died without ever learning the truth. Beth Prime got sick and died in a post-apocalyptic world, never knowing that the Rick who had been living with her was not her father at all. The Morty in this show, Morty Prime, is Rick Prime's actual biological grandson. The boy Rick C137 has spent the whole series dragging through the cosmos, protecting, using as a cloaking device, screaming at, saving, and clearly loving in his deeply broken way, is the grandson of the man who murdered his wife and daughter. That is not a footnote to the show, that is the engine of it. Every time Rick looks at Morty and chooses to stay, every time he comes back when he could leave, every time he builds something specifically to make that boy happy, even while pretending he does not care, he is doing something the show never announces out loud. He is choosing the family of the man who took everything from him. Not because Rick Prime's family owes him anything, not because it fixes what was broken, but because this is what is left. And Rick C137, for all his universe-breaking intelligence, has never been able to let go of the people who are in front of him. The show began with what looked like a simple setup. A genius grandfather lives with his daughter's family and takes his grandson on adventures. It turns out that setup was carrying an entirely different story underneath it the whole time. The genius is not the grandfather. The daughter is not his daughter. The grandson belongs to his enemy. And the adventures were always, at least in part, a man trying to figure out what to do with love he had no intention of developing for people he was only supposed to be watching. There is a version of Rick C137 who finds Rick Prime early, who gets his revenge, closes the chapter, and moves on. That version of Rick never appears in the show, because that version of Rick never fell for a family that was not his to fall for. The version we got stayed, and everything that follows, every bad decision, every moment of genuine warmth hidden inside cruelty, every choice Rick makes that contradicts everything he says he believes, starts here. With a man who lost his real family, spent decades trying to avenge them, and then quietly built a replacement life inside the ruins his enemy left behind. Which means the Rick you have been watching for 7 seasons is not the Rick this story was supposed to follow. He is the Rick who survived long enough to become a grandfather to someone else's grandson, in someone else's house, in a dimension he only moved into to wait for a man who never came. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And what makes all of that land is what the next secret reveals. Because the Morty in this story is not who you think he is either, and his connection to Rick Prime runs far deeper than the show ever announces directly. Section 2. Morty is not Rick's original grandson. There is a grave in the backyard of the Smith house. Most people who watch the show know this. It gets mentioned, it gets a brief moment of screen time, and then the show moves on. Because Rick and Morty is very good at dropping enormous things into the frame and then walking away before you have fully processed what you just saw. But that grave is not a throwaway detail. It is one of the most important things in the entire series. Because what is buried in that backyard is not a stranger. It is a version of Morty Smith. And the Morty who buried him is the same Morty who has been living in that house ever since, eating breakfast at that table, going to that school, calling that woman mom, as if nothing happened. As if a completely different version of his life did not just get left in the ground behind the house. To understand why any of this matters, you have to go back to Season 1. The episode is called Rick Potion Number 9. Morty asks Rick to make him a love potion, something to make his school crush Jessica like him. Rick makes it, Morty uses it, and then it goes catastrophically wrong in the way that most things Rick builds eventually go wrong. The potion spreads, it mutates, it combines with the flu Jessica already had, and it spreads further, and by the end of it, the majority of Earth's population has been transformed into hideous, twisted creatures that the show calls Cronenbergs, after the horror director. The planet is gone. Not destroyed, worse than destroyed. Still there, still running, still full of people who are now something that cannot be fixed. Rick tries to fix it. He cannot. He looks at what he has made, and he makes a decision that should be one of the most disturbing moments in the series, but gets processed as a plot device because the show delivers it so casually. They are going to leave. Not leave and come back. Leave and never come back. Rick finds a parallel dimension where a different version of himself has already solved the Cronenberg problem, but where that Rick and that Morty both died moments later in an accident. Rick and Morty travel to that dimension. They bury the bodies of their dead counterparts in the backyard, and then they walk inside and become those people. The family inside the house never finds out. The mom in that house, the dad, the sister, they just get their Rick and Morty back as far as they know. They have no idea there is a fresh grave in the backyard. They have no idea the 2 people who just walked through the door are not the same 2 people who left. Morty sits on his bed in this new house and cries. Not a little. The scene holds on him. He is 14 years old and he has just abandoned an entire world, his entire original world, and moved into a replacement. Rick, from the doorway, tells him not to think about it. That is the beginning of the secret this section is actually about, because what the show reveals years later, across the Season 5 and Season 6 premieres, is that the dimension Rick and Morty moved into after the Cronenberg disaster is not a random replacement dimension. It is a specific one. It is the dimension where Rick Prime came from. The Prime dimension. Rick Prime's original home. Let that settle. The Morty who has been in the show from Season 1, Episode 6 onwards, the Morty who grows and changes and develops and eventually helps hunt down Rick Prime, is Morty Prime. Rick Prime's actual biological grandson, the boy whose real grandfather is the man who murdered Rick C137's wife and daughter. The boy Rick C137 has been living with, traveling with, protecting and manipulating and clearly loving for the entire run of the show is not his grandson in any sense. Not biologically, not dimensionally, not in any way that the traditional definition of family would recognize. Rick C137's real grandson, the Morty who existed in Rick C137's original dimension, died with his grandmother Diane when Rick Prime's bomb went off. Rick C137 has no original Morty. He lost that child before the show began, along with everything else Rick Prime took from him. The Morty in this story is the grandson of his enemy. This is not a theory. The show confirms it in Solarix, the Season 6 premiere, where the portal reset forces everyone back to their dimension of origin. Morty Prime resets back to the Prime dimension. Rick C137 resets back to his original dimension, C137. They are separated. The show makes the dimensional identities explicit. Morty Prime belongs to Rick Prime's original home. Rick C137 belongs somewhere else entirely. They do not share a dimension of origin. They never did. What this does to your reading of their relationship across the first 5 seasons is significant. Every time Rick has been openly terrible to Morty, dismissive, careless, cruel in the small daily ways that accumulate across seasons, the show has presented this as Rick being Rick, as the genius grandfather who treats his grandson like a sidekick because that is simply how Rick operates. And that reading is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Because underneath it is a man who lost his real grandson before the show began, who moved into the home of the man who killed that grandson's grandmother, and who then developed a genuine attachment to a boy he had no genetic claim to, and who technically belongs to the person he has spent decades trying to kill. The grief and the love are tangled together in a way the show never untangles cleanly, because Rick never untangles anything cleanly. There is a specific moment in Season 6 that makes all of this visible without any of it being spoken aloud. When the portal reset sends Morty back to the Prime dimension, Rick Prime's original home, a world that has been Cronenberged and devastated, and separates him from Rick C137, the show lets both of them feel the separation. Not dramatically, not with a speech, just the weight of it. Two people who have been through everything together, suddenly on opposite sides of a dimensional wall, and neither of them belonging where they just landed. Rick C137 is back in his original dimension without his family. Morty Prime is back in a destroyed world without his grandfather, the grandfather who, technically, was never his grandfather at all. The show built this situation over 6 seasons, and then used the separation to demonstrate, without stating it, how completely real the bond had become despite none of the original premises supporting it. There is another layer to Morty Prime's identity that the show hints at but never fully lays out. Evil Morty, the most dangerous and intelligent Morty the show has produced, is referred to by Rick Prime in Season 7 as his original grandson. Rick Prime says this in the belief that he is speaking to his actual Morty before realizing he is not. The implication is that evil Morty, the Morty who enslaved a Rick and became president of the Citadel and eventually escaped the central finite curve entirely, may be from Rick Prime's original dimension. Maybe, in some version of events, the same Morty that Rick Prime originally abandoned. The show does not confirm this completely, but it places the breadcrumb with enough precision that it is not accidental. What it would mean, if true, is that Rick Prime abandoned his original Morty, left him to grow up in the Prime dimension without a grandfather, without the adventures, without any of the exposure to the multiverse that every other Morty gets. And that Morty eventually figured out on his own what Mortys actually are, what the Citadel actually is, and what the central finite curve actually does. And instead of accepting it, he spent years building a plan to burn the whole system down. The abandoned grandson becoming the most dangerous being in the central finite curve, because his grandfather left. Meanwhile, Rick C137, the Rick who chose his family over the multiverse, the Rick who was punished for that choice, ended up with a different Morty. A Morty who is also, technically, Rick Prime's grandson. Another version of the boy that Rick Prime walked away from. Rick C137 is raising the family that his enemy threw away, in both directions. This is the shape of the show once all the pieces are in place. Rick C137 loved his family, lost them, spent decades in grief and violence, and then stumbled into a replacement family that belonged to the man who destroyed his original one. He should not have stayed. There was no logical reason to stay. Rick Prime was never going to come back. The show confirms in Season 7 that Rick Prime returned to the Prime dimension precisely because the portal reset forced him there, not out of any desire to see Beth or Morty or anyone. He does not feel that way about them. He never has. Rick Prime is, in the most specific sense, someone who is incapable of the attachment that destroyed Rick C137's life. Rick C137 stayed anyway. He stayed with Morty Prime. He took the boy on every adventure. He built inventions to keep him safe, screamed at him when he was scared, put him in danger more times than can be counted, and also, quietly, in the moments the show allows before it cuts away, demonstrated over and over that he would not leave. That is the secret underneath the secret. Morty Prime is not Rick C137's real grandson, but Rick C137 chose him the same way he was once willing to choose a family over the multiverse. Not because the relationship was what it was supposed to be, because it became real regardless. There is a moment in the Season 7 episode Unmortrican where Rick C137 and Morty Prime hunt down Rick Prime together. They have been building to this for the entire series, and when it finally happens, the show does not frame it as a grandfather and grandson completing a family quest. It frames it as two people who built a bond out of circumstances neither of them chose, confronting the one person responsible for the fact that they found each other at all. Rick Prime, by killing Rick C137's family, created the chain of events that led to Rick C137 living in the Prime dimension, finding Morty Prime, and developing the relationship that defines the entire show. Rick Prime's cruelty is the reason these two people are together. His abandonment of his own family is the reason there was a vacancy for Rick C137 to fill. The show never says this out loud. It does not need to. The grave in the backyard holds a version of Morty that Rick C137 helped bury on the day he became, unofficially and without anyone's knowledge, the substitute grandfather for the grandson of his greatest enemy. It is covered in grass by now. The family who lives above it has no idea it is there. And the boy who helped dig it has grown across 7 seasons into someone almost unrecognizable from the nervous kid who cried on a bed in a borrowed house on the first night of a borrowed life. __quote _1__, which is exactly where the next secret begins. Because what Morty has become, what the adventures have slowly, quietly made him into, is something the show has been tracking from the very beginning, and it points somewhere nobody who watches the show for the comedy ever expects it to go. Section 3. Rick's nihilism is a lie he needs to survive. There is a phrase Rick Sanchez says constantly, "Wubba lubba dub dub." He says it like a punchline. He says it when something explodes, when an adventure ends, when he wants to fill a silence with noise. The show plays it as a catchphrase, the kind of thing that ends up on t-shirts and phone cases, and the kind of thing fans repeat without thinking too hard about where it comes from. It became one of the most recognizable things about the show within its first 2 seasons. Then, Season 2 tells you what it actually means. Bird Person, Rick's oldest friend, someone who has known him longer than almost anyone alive, translates it for Morty directly. In his people's language, Wubba Lubba Dub Dub means, "I am in great pain. Please help me." Rick has been saying this over and over, every single time. Not as a joke, not as a catchphrase, as a cry for help dressed up so thoroughly in absurdity that nobody around him ever stops to look at what is underneath it. That is the foundation of this section. Not the phrase itself, but what the phrase reveals about the most important lie in the entire show. Rick Sanchez has spent 7 seasons telling everyone around him, and telling the audience, that nothing matters, that he does not care, that feelings are weakness, that the universe is empty and the only rational response to that emptiness is to stop pretending otherwise. He delivers this worldview with total confidence. He is the smartest being in every universe he has ever visited. He says it like a man who has done the math and arrived at a conclusion that lesser minds are simply too afraid to accept. It is not true. Not one word of it. This is not a theory. The show proves it repeatedly with specific scenes and specific moments that it never walks back and never explains away. Rick's stated belief system, that nothing matters, that love is a chemical trick, that caring about people is a design flaw, is directly contradicted by his behavior across every season of the show. Not occasionally, constantly. The gap between what Rick says he believes and what Rick actually does is so wide and so consistent that it stops being a contradiction and starts being its own kind of argument. The argument is this: Rick does not believe nothing matters. Rick believes everything matters far too much. And nihilism, the idea that nothing is real or important, is the only story he has found that makes that survivable. Look at what the show actually shows you. In Season 2, Rick meets Unity, a being who can take over and control entire populations of people. They have a history together. Rick clearly loves Unity, or something close to love, in whatever broken way Rick is capable of it. The episode ends with Unity leaving him, not because Rick was cruel, but because Rick's presence makes Unity worse. Unity writes him a letter explaining this. Rick reads it. And then the show does something it almost never does. It stays with Rick, alone, in his garage, at his workbench. He prepares what is clearly meant to be a way to kill himself. He passes out from drinking before he can go through with it. The show does not comment on this. No character sees it. No one rushes in. The camera just watches a man who tells everyone nothing matters try to end his life because someone he loved chose to leave. That scene alone makes the nihilism impossible to take at face value. A person who truly believed nothing mattered would not be sitting at a workbench in the dark trying to find a reason not to exist. You do not grieve things that do not matter. You do not fall apart over loss if loss cannot touch you. Rick fell apart. The show showed it and then moved on. The way the show always moves on, trusting that you saw what you saw. Then there is Pickle Rick. The entire premise of Pickle Rick, an episode that became one of the most famous in the show's run, is that Rick turned himself into a pickle to avoid going to family therapy. He did not forget about it. He did not have a scheduling conflict. He performed a scientific transformation on his own body specifically so he would have a legitimate excuse not to sit in a room and talk about his feelings. The therapy session happens anyway. Beth takes the kids, and at the end of the episode, Rick shows up. He survived a sewer full of rats and cockroaches, built himself a working body out of their parts, fought through an entire government building, and arrived at the therapist's office. All, technically, to avoid being there. The therapist, Dr. Wong, says something to Rick that the show lets land without undercutting it. She tells him that she has no doubt he could survive any physical catastrophe the world could produce. She tells him he would probably be the last man standing after everything else was gone. And then she says, and probably the loneliest. She is not impressed by the pickle story. She does not find it clever or funny. She reads it immediately for what it is: a man who will go to staggering lengths to avoid being known. Not because he does not feel anything, because he feels too much and does not know what to do with it. Rick has no response to this. He sits there. He takes it. The man who has a comeback for literally everything, who can talk his way out of Federation prisons, who has outsmarted gods and governments and entire civilizations, cannot find a single thing to say to a therapist who is simply right about him. That silence is more revealing than any speech the show could have written for him. The Season 3 finale makes the behavioral contradiction impossible to ignore. Rick has spent the entire season telling Morty that his plan is to be the de facto patriarch of the household, to secure his place in the family, to win. And then the season ends with Rick genuinely having won. He has everything set up exactly as he wanted, and he chooses to give it up. He steps back. He lets Jerry come home. He restores the family to a version of normal because he can see that Beth is happier this way, even though it costs him the control he spent all season engineering. A man who believed nothing mattered would not do that. A man who was purely selfish, who only kept the family around as a strategic asset, would not hand back power because it made someone else feel better. Rick did. The show does not make a big moment out of it. He just does it, and then makes a joke, and the season ends. The show builds this pattern slowly enough that it is easy to miss if you are watching for the nihilism rather than watching for the behavior. Rick saves people he claims not to care about. Rick comes back for a grandson he describes as a tool. Rick dismantles his own plans when the cost turns out to be someone he loves. Over and over, season after season. There is also the question of what Rick does when he is alone. The show gives you glimpses of this rarely and briefly, because Rick alone is the version of Rick he works hardest to keep hidden. But what those glimpses show is not a man at peace with the void. It is a man who drinks until he passes out at his workbench, a man who keeps a photograph, a man who builds a robot, revealed in Season 7, specifically designed to be around Morty and make him happy while Rick is away hunting Rick Prime. Not a functional robot, not a robot with a mission, a robot whose entire purpose is to make a 14-year-old boy feel like his grandfather is still present. Rick built something just to make Morty feel loved. And then Rick kept it secret, because Rick cannot allow himself to be seen doing the things he actually does. That is the lie in its clearest form. It is not that Rick pretends to feel nothing when he feels nothing. It is that Rick performs feeling nothing while actively, consistently, demonstrably doing the things a person does when they care deeply. The performance is for everyone around him. It might also be for himself. Because if Rick admitted out loud that things matter to him, that Morty matters, that Beth matters, that the family he stumbled into and stayed with matters, then he would have to sit with the knowledge of what it felt like to lose all of that once before. He already knows what that feels like. It made him into what he is now. Rick Prime came to his garage, offered him the multiverse, and Rick said no because he had people he loved and that was enough. Then those people were taken from him. And Rick has spent every year since then building a version of himself that cannot be hurt that way again. A version that believes nothing matters, that mocks attachment, that treats love like a joke and caring like a flaw. It does not work. It has never worked. The show proves it does not work every time Rick acts against his own stated beliefs, which is constantly. Dr. Wong put it plainly in that therapy office. The armor is the problem. The intelligence, the performance of not caring, the endless forward motion through the cosmos, all of it is Rick refusing to be still long enough to feel what is already there. She was not telling Rick something he did not know. She was telling him something he knew so well he had spent decades running from it. Bird Person translated the catchphrase. "I am in great pain. Please help me." Rick has been saying this in every room he has ever walked into. He dressed it up in nonsense syllables and delivered it with a belch and turned it into a slogan. And somehow that worked well enough that most people who watched the show for years heard it as a joke. It was never a joke. It was a man asking for help in the only language he could bring himself to use. One that sounded like nothing, so that if nobody helped him, he could tell himself he had never really asked. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The nihilism is not a philosophy. It is a scar. And the scar goes deep enough that it eventually touches everything and everyone around him, which is exactly what the next secret is about. Because the structure Rick built around himself did not just protect him, it trapped everyone else too. Section 4. The Central Finite Curve. Rick built a prison and called it the multiverse. Every Rick who has ever used a portal gun believes he is the smartest being in the universe. Not just the smartest person in the room. Not just the most capable scientist on his planet. The smartest being in every universe he has ever visited. In every dimension he has ever stepped into. Across the entirety of existence as far as any of them have ever been able to see. This belief is so consistent, so total, so completely unchallenged by any Rick's actual experience of traveling the multiverse, that it stops feeling like arrogance after a while and starts feeling like simple fact. Rick is smarter than everyone. Every universe confirms this. Every adventure proves it. Every alien race, every galactic government, every cosmic entity that has ever gone up against a Rick has eventually lost. The Ricks believe this because their experience tells them it is true. Their experience was engineered. The single most important structural secret in the entire show is not a character secret or a family secret. It is a secret about the multiverse itself, about the reality that every Rick and every Morty and every alien and every viewer has been operating inside without knowing it. It is called the central finite curve. And once you understand what it is and who built it and why, the show becomes a fundamentally different story than the one it appeared to be telling. Here is what the central finite curve actually is. The multiverse is infinite. That is the show's foundational premise from the very first episode. Infinite universes, infinite versions of every person and every planet and every possible outcome of every possible decision. Rick's portal gun can take you anywhere. That is the power of it. Not just travel, but access to everything that has ever existed or could ever exist across all of reality. Except it cannot. Rick's portal gun, and every portal gun used by every Rick across the Citadel, can only travel within a specific section of the multiverse. A deliberately limited section. A section that was designed, built, and sealed off from the rest of infinite reality by Rick himself, alongside the Ricks who eventually formed the original Council of Ricks. What they built was a wall. Not a physical wall, a dimensional barrier that separates every universe where Rick is the smartest being alive from every universe where he is not. Everything outside that wall, every universe where someone smarter than Rick exists, every universe where Rick was never born, every universe where the natural order of things did not place Rick at the top, is locked away. Unreachable, invisible. The portal guns cannot get there. The Citadel cannot see it. Every Rick who has ever believed he was the undisputed genius of all reality was only ever visiting universes that had been pre-selected to confirm that belief. They built a wall around infinity. And then they handed every Morty a portal gun and said, "Here is the multiverse." Evil Morty explains this in the Season 5 finale with a clarity that the show had been building toward for 4 full seasons. He says it plainly. They separated all the infinite universes from all the infinite universes where Rick is the smartest man alive. He describes what every Morty has been living inside, an infinite crib built around an infinite baby. Every adventure, every dimension, every alien civilization any Morty has ever seen was inside that crib. Not because the real multiverse ended there, because Rick made sure the door only opened inward. The first time the show even hints at the central finite curve is Season 1, Episode 10. A member of the Council of Ricks tells Rick C137 that of all the Ricks in the central finite curve, he is the most difficult. The phrase gets said, and the show moves on. At that point in the series, most viewers hear it as flavor, interdimensional bureaucracy language that tells you the multiverse has some kind of organizational structure. You are not supposed to understand yet what it means. The show is planting the seed years before it intends to water it. What it actually means is that the central finite curve was already in place by Season 1, already built, already sealing off the larger multiverse from every Rick and every Morty the show had ever shown. Every adventure in Seasons 1 through 4 happened inside the prison. Nobody inside it knew it was a prison. Now think about what that means for Rick's entire identity. Rick's self-image, the core of everything he claims to be and believe, rests on the foundation that he is the smartest being in existence. Not just smart, the smartest. Smarter than any god or government or alien race the multiverse has to offer. This is not vanity for Rick the way it might be for a lesser character. It is load-bearing. It is the thing his nihilism depends on. If nothing matters and existence is meaningless, Rick can at least be the most capable person navigating that meaninglessness. He can at least have that. The intelligence is the one thing Rick has never allowed anyone or anything to take from him. The central finite curve is the reason that belief was never seriously challenged. Outside the curve, there are infinite universes where Rick is not the smartest being alive, where other forms of intelligence exist that dwarf his, where the certainty he has carried his entire life, the certainty that made him insufferable and brilliant and ultimately untouchable, would be exposed as something he manufactured rather than something he earned. The Ricks who built the curve knew this. They were smart enough to know it. so they made sure they would never have to face it. Rick C137 helped build this. The show confirms it through Evil Morty's research into Rick's memories. C137 was involved in the construction of the Curve and the Citadel. He oversaw it. He was one of the architects of the system that every Rick eventually used to guarantee his own supremacy across all of accessible reality. And then, in a move that is entirely consistent with everything Rick C137 does, he walked away from it. He abandoned the Citadel. He stopped participating, not because he had a change of heart about the ethics of building a dimensional prison to protect his ego, but because Rick C137 never stays in anything he builds. He makes things and leaves them. He assembles structures and walks out. The Citadel, the Council of Ricks, the central finite curve, he handed all of it to the other Ricks and disappeared into Rick Prime's home dimension to wait for a man who never came. The other Ricks kept running it. What the central finite curve also guaranteed, and this is the part the show surfaces through Evil Morty's explanation in Season 5, is that every Morty was trapped inside it too. Not just physically, psychologically. Every Morty who ever grew up believing Rick was the smartest being in existence, every Morty who deferred to Rick because the evidence of every dimension they had ever visited seemed to confirm that Rick was simply on a level beyond everyone else. All of that deference was based on information that had been curated. The Mortys were not wrong to be impressed by Rick. Rick is genuinely extraordinary. But they were never given the chance to see a universe where someone else was more extraordinary. The Curve made sure of that. This is why Evil Morty describes the situation the way he does. His anger is not the anger of someone who was lied to about a small thing. It is the anger of someone who grew up in a cage so well designed that it looked like the whole world. He did not find out that Rick was imperfect. He found out that the entire reality he had been living in was a construction. That the multiverse he thought he was exploring was a walled garden Rick built to make sure the gardener always looked like a god. What Evil Morty does with this knowledge, over multiple seasons and multiple plans, is attempt to escape. Not to punish Rick, not to take over, to get out. To go somewhere the Curve does not reach. Somewhere that Rick did not build and did not seal and does not control. By the end of Season 5, he succeeds. He destroys the mechanism holding the Curve together and walks through the hole into the wider multiverse, into a reality so vast and so uncontrolled that Rick has no power there whatsoever. The show then, in Season 6, has the dinosaurs fix the hole almost immediately. This is the show doing something it does regularly, delivering a genuine structural revelation with real weight, and then stepping back from the consequences before they become permanent. The Curve gets patched, the multiverse settles, the adventures continue, but the knowledge does not go away. You cannot unknow what the Curve is once Evil Morty has explained it. Every portal jump from that point forward exists inside a different context. The adventures are still real, the stakes are still real, but the frame around them has changed. There is also a smaller, quieter implication that the show plants without fully developing. Simple Rick. A Rick shown in the Citadel episode in Season 3, the Rick who makes wafers that taste like happiness because he experienced pure joy watching his daughter grow up, is described as being a certain number of iterations off the Curve. The exact phrasing the show uses suggests that Ricks who are further from the center of the Curve are less consumed by the need to be the smartest, less driven by the ego that defines most Ricks. Simple Rick found peace in watching Beth be happy. He did not need to be a god. He did not need to be untouchable. He just needed his daughter to smile at him. He is the Rick the Curve was designed to wall off from everyone else. Because a Rick who does not need to be the smartest being in existence is a Rick who does not need the Curve. And a Rick who does not need the Curve is a Rick who might start asking questions about why it was built in the first place. The Curve does not just keep lesser intelligences out, it keeps a certain kind of Rick in. The kind who is defined by his need to be dominant, to be supreme, to be the most capable thing in any room he enters. Rick C137 built the wall around infinity, and then spent the rest of the show bumping into its edges. Every moment where he acts like someone who loves his family. Every scene where his need to be needed overrides his performance of not caring. Every time he comes back when leaving would have been easier. These are the moments where the version of Rick who turned down the multiverse for Diane and Beth bleeds through the version he became after she died. The central finite curve is not just a plot device. It is a physical representation of Rick's psychology, built into the structure of reality itself. He made the universe smaller so he could always be the biggest thing in it. And then he lived inside that smaller universe and called it freedom. __quote _3 ___. The next secret is about the person who saw through all of it. Not Rick, not Morty. The one character in the show who was never supposed to figure any of this out, and who figured out more than any of them. Because his grandfather left him behind, and he had nothing to do for years except think. Section 5. Evil Morty was never villainous. He was just awake. The first time you see him, he is standing in a crowd. No speech, no dramatic entrance, no moment where the camera lingers on him to signal that this person matters. He is just a Morty among Mortys at the end of a Season 1 episode, quietly removing an eye patch and crushing a small device under his foot. The other Ricks and Mortys around him have no idea what just happened. The audience barely registers it either, because the show has spent the episode making you look at something else entirely. By the time you realize what you witnessed, the episode is over. That is how Evil Morty introduces himself, not with a bang, with a quiet, deliberate act of covering his tracks and walking away. It is the most honest introduction the show could have given him, because Evil Morty, the character the show spent years building into its most significant antagonist, is not a villain in the way the show initially lets you believe. He is not cruel for the sake of cruelty. He is not power-hungry in the way a traditional antagonist is power-hungry. He does not want to rule anything. He does not want to destroy anything for the pleasure of destruction. What he wants, across every season he appears in and every plan he executes, is one thing only. He wants to leave. To understand why that matters, why the desire to simply leave makes this Morty the most dangerous and most important character the show has produced outside of Rick himself, you have to understand what he found out. Because Evil Morty's entire arc is the arc of a person who learned the truth about his situation and decided he would rather burn everything down than keep pretending the cage was a home. His origin is revealed in Season 7, in the episode Unspoken. Before he was Evil Morty, before the eye patch and the plans and the presidency of the Citadel, he was just a Morty. An ordinary Morty, living the ordinary Morty life. Dragged on adventures, used as a tool, absorbing whatever damage the universe threw at him, and then waking up and doing it again the next day. The same cycle every Morty lives inside. The same cycle the central finite curve was built to sustain. At some point, this Morty got tired. Not the regular tired that every Morty feels. The exhaustion that comes from being screamed at and endangered and treated like a sidekick by a grandfather who is either too selfish or too broken to treat you like a person. This Morty got tired in a deeper, more irreversible way. He thought about his situation. Really thought about it. And what he concluded was that the situation was not going to improve on its own. His Rick was not going to change. The adventures were not going to become safer. The dynamic between Ricks and Mortys, the fundamental imbalance of it, the way Ricks used Mortys and Mortys kept coming back, was not a flaw in the system. It was the system working exactly as designed. So he did something no Morty had ever done before. He got his Rick blackout drunk. And while his Rick was unconscious, he built a device that would allow him to control Rick remotely. He hid the device under a black eye patch. He scalped his own Rick and attached the control mechanism directly to his brain. And then he became Evil Rick's controller, a Morty pulling the strings of a Rick, reversing the fundamental power structure that every other Morty in the central finite curve had simply accepted as the natural order of things. This is not the act of a villain. This is the act of a person who had been treated as a tool for long enough that he decided to stop being one. The method is brutal. The show does not pretend otherwise. But the motivation, the refusal to keep being used, is something the show treats with complete seriousness. Evil Morty is not wrong about what was done to him. He was used. Every Morty was used. The difference between evil Morty and every other Morty is not that he suffered more. It is that he refused to normalize the suffering. After taking control of his Rick, he erased himself from the Citadel's records entirely. He walked into the Morty Agency, the place in the Citadel that tracks and manages Morty variants, and deleted every piece of data that identified him. From that point forward, he did not exist in the system. No Rick could track him. No Citadel authority could find him. He had made himself invisible inside the very structure built to contain him. Then he started learning. He captured Ricks, not to hurt them, to extract information from them. He needed to know how the Citadel worked. He needed to know its weaknesses, its architecture, the mechanics of how it sustained itself. He captured Mortys too, and used them as cloaking devices, using the same Morty brainwave trick that Ricks had always used, but in reverse. Using Mortys to hide a Rick's signal rather than using a Morty to hide a Rick's intelligence. He turned the system's own logic against itself. What he was building toward the entire time was the central finite curve. At some point during all of this research and planning, evil Morty learned that the multiverse was not what every Rick and every Morty had been told it was. He found out about the wall. He found out that every adventure, every dimension, every seemingly infinite expanse of reality that any Morty had ever explored was a controlled section of a much larger existence. He found out that the infinite multiverse Rick had always talked about was not infinite at all. It was a carefully managed garden where Rick was always guaranteed to be the most powerful thing growing in it. And evil Morty understood, with total clarity, what this meant for him and for every other Morty who had ever lived. They had never had a choice. Not a real one. The Ricks had built the cage before any Morty was born into it. The adventures were real, the danger was real, the pain was real, but the possibility of ever encountering something bigger than Rick, something that might shift the balance, something that might make Rick's dominance feel uncertain rather than absolute, that had been removed before the game started. The Mortys were not just sidekicks, they were prisoners who had been convinced they were travelers. This is what evil Morty says in the Season 5 finale, and the show lets him say it without undercutting him. There are no infinite versions of Rick, he tells Morty Prime. Rick is an infinite smear of one difficult old man, and Mortys are attached to him infinitely through his weakness and through their own forgiveness. This is why they are with him. This is why they exist in this configuration. Not because it is natural, because it was constructed. Morty Prime pushes back. Morty Prime, at this point in the show, still believes in Rick on some fundamental level, still holds on to the idea that the relationship, for all its damage, is real and worth preserving. Evil Morty is not interested in that argument. He has already had it with himself, years ago, and he settled it. The relationship is real. The love, on Rick's side, might even be genuine in whatever broken form Rick's love takes. None of that changes the structure. None of that changes the fact that Morty was bred for this role, that his brainwave pattern was genetically shaped to be useful to Rick, that the entire system was designed so that Mortys would always be available and always be compliant. Evil Morty's plan to escape the curve required three things. First, he needed control of the Citadel, because the Citadel's dimensional drive was the machine that maintained the curve's barrier. Second, he needed the specific schematics from Rick C137's memory, because C137 was one of the architects of the curve and carried the technical knowledge needed to break through it. Third, he needed the resources of the entire Citadel, every Rick, every Morty, every piece of technology the system had accumulated, directed at a single point in the barrier. He got all three. His path to the Citadel presidency is one of the most methodical things the show has ever depicted. He ran as candidate Morty, a Morty running for president, which every Rick on the Citadel treated as a joke. He gave a speech about the class divide between Ricks and Mortys, about the way Mortys were treated as lesser, about the fundamental inequality built into the Citadel structure. The Mortys believed him because he was saying true things. Enough of the Ricks voted for him because they found the idea amusing. He won. And then he killed most of the council and took full control. The show does not frame this as a villain seizing power. The Ricks he removed were the Ricks who would have blocked his escape. The entire presidency was not about ruling the Citadel. It was about using the Citadel as a key. He needed to be president for approximately as long as it took to aim the dimensional drive at the curve and fire it. Once that was done, he destroyed the Citadel, killed enormous numbers of Ricks and Mortys in the process, and walked through the hole into the wider multiverse. The show then does something interesting with him in Season 7. Evil Morty, living beyond the curve, is not building an empire. He is not raising an army. He is not plotting a return to power. He is living in a space mansion, going on adventures, doing exactly what Rick always claimed to want. Pure freedom. No attachments, no obligations, existence entirely on his own terms. He is interrupted by Rick C137 and Morty Prime accidentally destabilizing dimensions in their hunt for Rick Prime, which pulls evil Morty back into contact with them. He is annoyed. Not because his plans are threatened, because his peace is disturbed. That is the most revealing detail the show has produced about evil Morty. The thing he wanted more than power, more than revenge, more than any grand cosmic reckoning, was to be left alone. To exist in a reality where no Rick had arranged the furniture. To wake up in a dimension where his presence was not predetermined by someone else's need to feel supreme. He eventually helps Rick C137 and Morty Prime defeat Rick Prime in Unmortrican. Not out of loyalty or love, but because Rick Prime's Omega device, a weapon capable of killing people across infinite dimensions simultaneously, was a threat to evil Morty's freedom as much as anyone else's. He helps. He steals the plans for the Omega device for himself as insurance. He warns Rick C137 to leave him alone, and then he leaves. Rick Prime, during their confrontation, makes a mistake that tells you everything. He looks at evil Morty and calls him original grandson, believing, for a moment, that he is speaking to his actual Morty from his home dimension, the Morty he abandoned. The one he left behind when he chose the multiverse over his family. The show does not linger on this. It moves forward. But the implication hangs there. Evil Morty may be the Morty that Rick Prime threw away. The boy left in the Prime dimension while Rick Prime went off to be a god. That abandoned boy grew up, figured out the whole system, burned down the wall Rick built around infinity, and made himself free. Evil Morty was never a villain. He was a Morty who read the situation accurately and acted on what he read. The show named him evil because that is what Rick called any Morty who stopped being useful. Any Morty who got tired. Any Morty who decided that the crib was a crib and wanted out. The real question the show raises, and never quite answers, is how many other Mortys would have made the same choice if they had been given the same information. __quote _4__. Which brings the story back to the Morty who did not make that choice. Morty Prime, the boy who stayed. The boy who kept going on adventures and kept forgiving and kept choosing Rick over and over. And what that choice has slowly, quietly, without any announcement, been turning him into. Because Morty Prime has his own secret, and it is the one the show has been building longest of all. Section 6. Beth was a scary kid, and Rick built a world to contain her. There is a toy box that Rick Sanchez built for his daughter when she was a child. The show reveals what was inside it in Season 3, and the list is so specific and so disturbing that it changes everything you thought you understood about Beth Smith. Not just about who she is now, the horse surgeon with the wine glass and the abandonment issues and the complicated feelings about her father, about who she was before any of that. About what kind of child grows up to become the woman the show has been portraying since the pilot. The items Rick built for young Beth, at her request, include the following: a ray gun, a whip that makes people like you, invisible handcuffs, a device described as a parent trap that turned out to be a functional bear trap, shoes that erase the sound of footsteps, false fingerprints, and a teddy bear with anatomically correct internal organs. A child asked for these things. Her father built them. Rick does not reveal this list as a confession of bad parenting, though it is that too. He reveals it as evidence, proof that Beth, as a child, was not simply troubled in the ordinary way that children of absent or difficult parents sometimes become troubled. He says it directly, without softening it. She was a scary kid. He attributes this partly to himself, to his own mental state and the behavior he modeled, and the fact that he was absent for enormous stretches of her childhood. But he also makes clear that something was already there, that Beth was not only damaged by her circumstances, that she arrived at her circumstances with something already built into her that the circumstances then shaped and directed. This is the foundation of Beth's character secret, not the abandonment, not the alcoholism, not the desperate need for her father's approval that drives most of her decisions across the series. Those are symptoms. The secret is what they are symptoms of. Beth Smith inherited her father's capacity for coldness, and unlike Rick, she spent most of the show hiding it. To understand how deep this goes, you have to look at what Rick actually built for her beyond the weapons and the tools. At Beth's request, Rick constructed an entire world. He called it Fruppyland. It was a complete, self-contained fantasy dimension, filled with harmless creatures with nothing capable of causing real harm, designed specifically to be a safe space for a child whose impulses were apparently too dangerous to be fully expressed in the real world. Rick built his daughter a universe because the ordinary world was not equipped to contain her. Beth has no memory of most of her childhood. This is mentioned in the show before the ABCs of Beth, woven into earlier episodes as a background detail that reads as sadness. A girl whose father was absent, whose childhood years are mostly blank, who grew up largely without the parent she idolized. The absence of memory reads initially as a consequence of trauma. Children sometimes do not retain the years that hurt them most. By season 3, the show offers a different explanation for the gaps. Beth was not just growing up without Rick. She was growing up with Rick's tools, Rick's world, Rick's willingness to build whatever his daughter asked for without asking too many questions about why she wanted it. And what she wanted, repeatedly, reveals a child who was already thinking about control, about making people like her by force, about moving without being heard, about reaching into the mechanics of a situation and arranging them in her favor. These are not the requests of a curious child who found science interesting. These are the requests of a child who understood power and wanted access to it. The moment the episode has been building toward, the reason Rick reveals all of this, is the story of Tommy. Tommy was a boy Beth knew as a child. A real boy, not a creature from Fruppyland, who Beth invited into her private world and then left there. Not temporarily, not by accident. She led him into Fruppyland and abandoned him, on purpose. The show confirms this happened because Beth was jealous of Tommy's relationship with his own father, the simple, stable, loving relationship that Beth wanted with Rick and could not have. She saw a boy whose father was present and attentive, and she could not tolerate it. So she took him somewhere no one would find him, and she left him there. Tommy survived Fruppyland for decades by means the show describes but does not dwell on, because what he had to do to eat and continue living inside a world of harmless creatures is genuinely horrifying. By the time the show reaches him, he has been there for years. His father spent all that time believing his son was simply missing, lost somewhere, gone, a grief that never closed. Beth's initial response when this is laid out in front of her is denial. She does not remember it. She pushes back against the idea that she was capable of something like that. And then Rick shows her the toy box. Shows her the item she asked him to build. Shows her the evidence that the child who requested invisible handcuffs and a bear trap and a whip that makes people like you was more than capable of making the decision she made in Fruppyland. The denial cracks. Slowly. And what comes through underneath it is something the show handles with more care than most viewers give it credit for. Not a villain reveal, but a recognition. Beth recognizes herself in what Rick is describing. She cannot fully accept it, not yet, but she cannot fully reject it either. The toys are real. The world he built her is real. Tommy is real. standing in front of her after decades in a dimension she put him in. Rick tells her, in the same episode, that she shares his sociopathic tendencies. He says this not as an accusation, but as an acknowledgement. He is not angry at her for being this way. He helped make her this way. He built her the tools. He created the world. He was absent for the years when a father being present might have redirected whatever was developing in his daughter. And then he came back and continued to enable it, because enabling is the only kind of parenting Rick has ever known how to do. The show then does something quietly remarkable with this information. Rather than using it to make Beth a villain, rather than turning her into a monster that the audience is supposed to fear or judge, it uses it to explain every decision she has made across the series. The reason she chose Jerry is sitting right there in the Fruppyland story. Jerry does not leave. He cannot leave. Not really, not permanently. His entire function in Beth's life is to be the thing that stays. She did not marry someone who would challenge her or match her or make her feel like an equal. She married someone she would never have to worry about losing, because losing people is the wound Beth has been living inside since childhood. The reason she tolerates Rick, the reason she lets him drag Morty into danger, covers for his behavior, defends him against Jerry's entirely reasonable objections, is also sitting there. Rick is the one she is most afraid of losing, and she knows on some level that she only keeps him around by not asking too many questions, by not looking too closely, by performing the version of herself that he can tolerate being near. The cloning decision in Season 3 brings all of this to a point. Rick offers Beth a clone, a perfect copy of herself to stay home with the family, while the real Beth goes out and lives whatever life she actually wants to live. Beth accepts. She lets Rick make the clone. And then neither Beth nor the audience ever finds out which one is which, because Rick removes his own memory of which Beth went to space and which stayed home. By the end of Season 4, there are two Beths, Space Beth and Earth Beth, and neither of them knows which is the original. The show's decision to make this permanent, to never resolve which Beth is real, is one of its most interesting choices. Because what it says about Beth's relationship to her own identity is this. She has spent so long performing different versions of herself for different people. The devoted daughter for Rick, the stable wife for Jerry, the good mother for the kids, the competent professional at work, that the question of which version is real no longer has a clean answer. She split herself in two, and both halves kept going, and eventually stopped caring which one started. Rick, in the ABCs of Beth, offers her something her father has almost never offered her directly: honesty. He tells her what she is. He does not dress it up or manage her reaction. He shows her the toy box and says what it means and lets her sit with it. And in that honesty, there is something that functions, in Rick's broken way, as love. Not comfort, not reassurance, but the respect of telling someone the truth about themselves and trusting them to survive it. Beth survives it. Not cleanly, not without damage. She spends the rest of Season 3 working through what she learned, making decisions she has been avoiding for years, and slowly building a version of herself that does not require Rick's presence to feel stable. By the Season 3 finale, she does something she has never done before in the series. She tells Rick to leave. Not because she is angry at him, because she has finally understood, after everything the season has put her through, that her need to keep him close has been costing her more than his absence ever did. That is the character arc that the toy box unlocks. Not Beth becoming a monster, Beth becoming honest about who she is, what she inherited, what she has been hiding from herself and from everyone around her for her entire adult life. The show gave her the most uncomfortable possible secret and then used it to build the most human arc in its entire run. Beth is not the character most viewers spend time thinking about when they think about Rick and Morty. She sits behind Rick and Morty in the title and in the audience's attention, and the show has allowed that to happen in part because her secrets are not the spectacular kind. They are the quiet, recognizable, deeply uncomfortable kind. The kind that make you look at a person you thought you understood and realize the picture was always more complicated than it looked. ___quote_5___. which is also exactly what the next secret is about. Because while Beth's story is about what was hidden underneath the surface of someone the show kept in the background, the next secret is about something hiding in plain sight at the very center of the show. Something the show has been building into Morty from the very beginning, so gradually and so quietly that most people who have watched every episode have still not fully clocked what it adds up to. Section 7. The Morty Aura. Why Rick keeps Morty close, and why that's sinister. There is a practical reason Rick Sanchez keeps a 14-year-old boy with him at all times. It is not love. It is not mentorship. It is not even the complicated, half-buried affection that slowly develops across the series and becomes one of the show's most genuine emotional threads. Those things are real, and they matter, and the show earns them across 7 seasons of evidence. But they are not the reason Rick brought Morty along in the first place. The reason Rick brought Morty along is mechanical, functional. The kind of reason a person gives for carrying a tool, not a companion, not a grandson, but a specific piece of equipment that solves a specific problem. Morty's brain makes Rick invisible. This is explained in Season 1 in the episode Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, when the Council of Ricks lays out the logic to Rick C137 directly. Every Rick in the central finite curve produces a particular kind of mental signal, a brainwave pattern that reflects extreme intelligence, the kind of output that comes from a mind operating at the level Rick's operates at. This signal is detectable. Enemies of Rick, tracking systems, the Galactic Federation's monitoring technology, all of it can lock onto that signal and find him. Rick is the smartest being in every universe he visits, and that intelligence announces itself whether he wants it to or not. Morty's brain cancels that signal out. Not because Morty is unintelligent in a simple way, because Morty's brainwave pattern is so different from Rick's, so specific in its chaotic, anxious, unstructured frequency, that when the two of them are in close proximity, Morty's signal drowns out Rick's. The genius disappears into the noise. From the outside, with Morty nearby, Rick does not read as the most dangerous and detectable mind in the multiverse. He reads as nothing particularly remarkable at all. The show uses the word camouflage. That is the precise word it chooses. Morty is Rick's camouflage. The boy is a biological shield that Rick wears everywhere he goes, and the boy had no idea this was true for the entire first season of the show. Now sit with what that means. Rick showed up at the Smith house with a story about wanting to reconnect with his daughter. He moved into the garage. He started taking Morty on adventures, pulling him out of school, endangering him, dragging him across the multiverse on missions that left Morty traumatized in ways the show documents across every season. Rick told Morty he was his partner, his companion, the person he chose above all others to share the wonders of the cosmos with. And underneath all of that, partially at least, Morty was doing a job. A job nobody asked him to apply for, nobody told him about, and nobody paid him for. He was keeping Rick safe by existing near him. His anxiety, his average grades, his specific neurological makeup, the things the show presents as Morty's limitations, the things Rick mocks him for constantly, are the exact features that make him useful. Morty is most valuable to Rick as a shield, precisely because of the qualities that Rick spends the most time criticizing. The cruelty of that is not something the show shouts at you. It just places it in the frame and lets it sit there. The Council of Ricks confirms that this is not a secret Rick invented or discovered alone. It is institutional knowledge. Every Rick in the central finite curve knows it. The Citadel was built around it. There is an entire system, the Jerry Burry daycare, the Morty tracking databases, the way the Citadel produces and manages Morty variants across dimensions, designed to ensure that every Rick has access to a Morty. Not because every Rick loves his grandson, because every Rick needs the camouflage. This means the relationship between Rick and Morty, not just Rick C137 and Morty Prime, but every Rick and every Morty across the entire central finite curve, began as a transaction. Rick needed something Morty could provide. The love, where it exists, grew on top of that foundation. But the foundation is utility. Season 5 makes this explicit in the darkest possible way through evil Morty's speech. He does not just say that Mortys are used as tools, he says that Mortys are bred for this. The brainwave pattern, the specific chaotic frequency that makes Morty's brain useful to Rick, is not an accident. It is a genetic product of the Citadel's systems, maintained and cultivated across dimensions to ensure a continuous supply of compatible Mortys. Rick did not find a grandson whose brain happened to be useful. The whole system was designed to produce grandsons whose brains would be useful. The word evil Morty uses is bred. Mortys were bred the way you breed animals for specific traits. Not with cruelty necessarily, but with intention. With a desired outcome in mind that the Mortys themselves were never consulted about. This information makes Morty Prime's entire journey across the series sit differently. Every adventure, every traumatic experience, every moment where Morty came back damaged in some new way and then went out and did it again, all of it happened in the context of a boy who was selected for this role before he was old enough to have an opinion about it. His anxiety is a feature of the brainwave pattern that makes him valuable. His low academic performance, the thing teachers and family members point to repeatedly as evidence that Morty is not smart, is connected to the same neurological makeup that Rick's entire safety depends on. Morty's weaknesses are the product Rick needs. The system has every reason to preserve them. This is why Rick's relationship with Morty's intelligence is so layered and so strange across the series. Rick mocks Morty constantly for being slow, for not understanding things quickly, for making decisions that a smarter person would not make. But Rick also, in moments scattered carefully across the series, demonstrates that he is aware Morty is not as limited as the performance of limitations suggests. In Total Recall Season 2, Morty is the first person to figure out how the alien parasites work. Not Rick, not Summer, Morty. He identifies the logic of the situation, that the parasites can only generate positive memories, never negative ones, and uses that to cut through the chaos while everyone else is still disoriented. Rick has spent the whole episode being Rick, and Morty solves the core problem quietly and correctly. In Morty Night Run, also Season 2, Morty distracts a telepathic being capable of reading minds by asking it to sing. The being is surprised. It did not anticipate the request. Morty used the one approach that a mind reader could not simply read in advance, because it was not a plan so much as a genuine impulse. Rick, with all his intelligence, might have overthought it. Morty did not overthink it. The show gives Morty these moments without making a big announcement about them. It does not stop and say, "Look how capable he actually is." It just shows you and moves on. Because Rick and Morty both need the dynamic to stay in place. Rick needs to believe, or perform believing, that Morty requires his guidance. And Morty, for most of the series, needs to believe that Rick is irreplaceable. The camouflage function supports that dynamic. As long as Morty is close to Rick, Rick is protected. Which means Rick has a structural incentive to keep Morty nearby that exists completely independently of whatever genuine feelings he has developed. The affection and the utility are pointed in the same direction, which makes it almost impossible to see where one ends and the other begins. There is a moment in Season 7 that cuts through this more cleanly than almost anything else the show has produced. Rick, absent from the family while hunting Rick Prime, leaves a robot, the Rickbot, to be with Morty in his place. The robot is not built for a mission. It is not built to protect Morty from external threats, or to maintain the camouflage function, or to serve any strategic purpose. It is built, as Rick eventually admits, specifically to make Morty happy, to make him feel like his grandfather is present, to give him the experience of having Rick around while Rick is somewhere else entirely. Rick built a machine to perform emotional presence for a boy he loves but cannot stay with. That is the clearest picture the show has ever given of the gap between what Rick can feel and what Rick can do. He feels enough to build something whose entire function is Morty's happiness. He cannot feel enough, or cannot allow himself to feel enough, to simply stay. The camouflage function requires proximity. The emotional function apparently does not. And Rick chose the mission over the proximity, and then tried to paper over the choice with a robot. Morty's response when he finds out about the Rickbot is anger. Real anger, not the performed frustration that colors a lot of his interactions with Rick. He is furious that Rick tricked him. That Rick replaced himself with a machine rather than including Morty in the hunt for Rick Prime. That Rick once again made a decision about Morty's life, what Morty would experience, what Morty would be protected from, without asking. This is the pattern the show has been documenting since the beginning. Rick deciding what Morty needs. Rick arranging Morty's experience according to what Rick thinks is best, or what Rick can tolerate, or what serves Rick's purposes. Even when the intention is genuine care, and by season 7 it clearly is, the structure is the same structure that has always been there. Rick at the center, deciding. Morty at the edge, receiving. The camouflage function is where that structure started. Not with love. Not with a grandfather who wanted to share the wonders of existence with his grandson. With a brilliant, hunted man who needed somewhere to hide and found that the best hiding place available was the nervous system of a 14-year-old boy who had no idea he was being used. What makes it bearable, what keeps the show from collapsing under the weight of this, is that Rick C137 chose to stay when he did not have to, that the utility became genuine, that the boy who was selected for his usefulness became someone Rick built a robot for, hunted killers for, gave up control for, came back to again and again across 7 seasons. The foundation was sinister. What was built on top of it became something real. __quote _6 __. But understanding the foundation changes how you read every brick above it. And it makes the next secret, about what the adventures have been quietly doing to Morty across all those seasons of closeness and danger and damage, land with a weight it cannot carry if you are still thinking of Morty as simply the boy Rick chose to bring along for company. Section 8. Morty is secretly becoming Rick, and the show has been tracking it for 7 seasons. There is a scene near the end of Season 5 where Morty dismantles an entire castle full of soldiers by himself. Not with Rick's help. Not with one of Rick's gadgets handed to him at the last second. He walks in armed with weapons he selected himself from the garage, moves through the castle systematically, and comes out the other side with the thing he went in for. Rick, at that point in the episode, is badly injured and cannot drive their ship. Morty takes the wheel. He gets them out. The show does not stop to congratulate him. It does not frame it as a moment of growth or a turning point. It just happens, and then the episode continues, because by season 5, Morty doing something like this is no longer remarkable enough to pause for. That is the whole secret in a single image. Not that Morty did something impressive, that the show no longer treats it as impressive, that it has become expected. Go back to season 1 and watch the first episode. The Morty in that episode cannot function. He falls asleep at the breakfast table. He cannot keep up with a conversation. He is genuinely, visibly overwhelmed by the most basic exposure to Rick's world. The mega seeds, the customs agents, the portal gun, the idea that other dimensions exist at all. He looks at Rick's life, and it looks to him like something from another species, something he is not built for and cannot survive. The show spent 7 seasons proving that assessment wrong, but it did not do it the clean way. Not through training montages or inspiring speeches or the kind of structured growth arc where a character identifies their weakness and works to overcome it. It did it the way real change actually happens. Slowly, messily, through accumulated experience that leaves marks. Through trauma absorbed and then used. Through watching Rick and learning, the way children learn from the adults closest to them, whether those adults are good models or not. Morty has been learning from Rick for 7 seasons, and the show has been documenting, quietly and without announcement, exactly what that education produces. In Season 1, Morty asks Rick for a love potion. It is a pure teenager request, clumsy and selfish and driven entirely by his feelings for Jessica. He is not thinking about consequences. He is not thinking about other people. He wants a girl to like him, and he asks the person most capable of making that happen to make it happen. The Cronenberg disaster that follows is partially Rick's fault for making the potion, and partially Morty's fault for using it. The show splits the blame roughly down the middle. But here is the part that matters for this section. When the Cronenberg disaster happens, when the entire planet is transformed and cannot be fixed, Morty does not try to fix it. He does not demand that Rick find a solution. He does not argue for the people they are leaving behind. He gets in the ship. He goes to the replacement dimension. He buries a body in a backyard and walks into a house and becomes someone else's version of himself. And then he goes upstairs and cries, alone, while Rick tells him not to think about it. He listened. He genuinely stopped thinking about it. The show demonstrates this across subsequent seasons. Morty does not go back. He does not try to return to his original family. He does not carry the guilt of the Cronenberg disaster as an ongoing weight that shapes his decisions. He absorbed it, buried it, literally buried it, and moved forward. That is not the behavior of the anxious, overwhelmed boy from the pilot. That is the behavior of someone who has already begun learning Rick's most fundamental survival skill: compartmentalization so complete it functions like forgetting. By Season 2, Morty is noticeably different from the boy in Season 1. He kills Fart, a telepathic gaseous being he had spent the whole episode trying to protect, with an antimatter gun when he finds out that Fart intends to destroy all carbon-based life in the universe. He does not hesitate once he has the information he needs. He makes the calculation. He acts on it. The show gives him a brief moment of grief for the decision, because Morty is still someone who feels things, but the moment is brief. The action is clean and final. An earlier Morty would have looked for another way. This Morty found the most direct path and took it. Season 2 also gives the audience the Purging Planet episode, a world where one night a year, all violence is legal and encouraged. The episode gives Morty a chemical explanation for his behavior. Rick says they were compounds in the chocolate bars that triggered the violence, and Morty accepts this explanation. But the show pulls the rug out in the final seconds. The chocolate bars Morty was given were a new flavor. They did not contain the compounds Rick described. The violence was not chemical. It was Morty. He killed a lighthouse keeper out of anger. He went on a rampage. And when the explanation that excused all of it turned out to be wrong, the show just ended, without addressing it, without Morty finding out, without resolution. The show trusted you to hold that information yourself, because Morty could not. By Season 3, Morty can operate Rick's equipment. Not all of it, not perfectly, but he knows where things are, how they function, what they are capable of. He disarms the traps Rick drunkenly built for the Vindicators faster than anyone else because he knows his grandfather well enough to predict the logic. He has been paying attention for 3 seasons, and the attention has produced knowledge. The knowledge produces capability. The capability produces a Morty who is quietly, incrementally less dependent on Rick than he was the season before. Season 4 brings the Death Crystal episode. Edge of Tomorty, Rick Die Rickpeat, opens with Morty in possession of a crystal that shows him the various ways he might die. One of the deaths it shows him is dying beside Jessica, his longtime crush, the girl he has wanted to be with since the pilot. Morty decides he wants that death. Not because he wants to die, but because dying beside Jessica implies being with Jessica, and he wants that badly enough to pursue it across the episode, even when the pursuit requires mass destruction. He causes significant death and damage across multiple dimensions in this episode. He does it because the crystal told him it was on the path to the outcome he wanted. He follows the logic of it, he commits to it. The scale of what he does, the number of people who die or are hurt because of his choices in this episode, is enormous, and the show does not fully reckon with it by the end. Morty does not reckon with it either. He puts the crystal down and moves on. That is Rick's behavior. Exactly Rick's behavior. The willingness to cause enormous collateral damage in pursuit of a personal goal. The ability to continue functioning normally in the aftermath. The show is not subtle about the parallel. It is deliberate. Morty is doing in Season 4 what Rick has been doing since the beginning. And he is doing it for a reason as small and human as wanting a girl to like him, which makes it more disturbing, not less, because at least Rick's worst actions usually involve stakes that are cosmically large. Morty's are personal, intimate. He is becoming Rick on a smaller scale, which is somehow worse. The Season 5 castle sequence, Morty alone in an enemy fortress, armed and effective and completely in control of himself, is the clearest visual summary of 7 seasons of this transformation. He is not fighting because Rick needs him to. He is not acting out of panic or desperation. He is there because he decided to be there, with weapons he chose, executing a plan he made, in a situation he assessed and found manageable. The nervous boy from the pilot would have been paralyzed. This Morty walked through without stopping. There is also the matter of what Morty knows by the later seasons. He knows how to operate the portal gun. He knows the locations of Rick's weapons. He understands the multiverse at a level that most of the alien civilizations the show has depicted do not reach. He has died in Rick's simulations. He has been tortured, betrayed, abandoned, replaced. He has buried his own body. He has raised a child. He has killed people and beings across multiple dimensions and in multiple contexts. He has been desensitized to things that would end most people's capacity to function. Each of those experiences took something from him, and each of them added something too. Not wisdom exactly, or not only wisdom. Also the specific hardness that comes from having survived enough that survival no longer feels like a remarkable achievement. Morty does not marvel at coming back from things the way he did in Season 1. He expects to come back. He has established a track record of coming back. That expectation is indistinguishable, from the outside, from Rick's certainty that he will survive whatever comes next. The show tracks this through small details as much as large ones. Morty's reactions getting shorter, his willingness to engage with violence growing, his capacity to make cold calculations increasing. His emotional response is still present. He is not Rick yet, not fully, not in the way that would make him unrecognizable, but narrowing, becoming more selective, being deployed less often and with more control. Rick, in his most honest moments, seems aware of this, not always comfortable with it. There is a version of Rick that needs Morty to stay innocent, needs the contrast between them, needs someone nearby who still flinches at the things Rick stopped flinching at long ago. Every time Morty stops flinching at something new, Rick loses a piece of that contrast, loses a piece of the thing that made Morty distinct from him. The show has never stated out loud that Morty is becoming Rick. It does not need to. It just keeps showing you Morty doing Rick things, making Rick choices, surviving Rick experiences, absorbing Rick's worldview through years of close and damaging proximity, and trusts you to put the picture together. The picture is this. Rick Sanchez, at some point in his past, was probably not so different from the boy in Season 1, brilliant in ways that had not yet been recognized, anxious in ways that had not yet been managed, capable of love in ways that had not yet been tested. Something turned him into what he is now. A long series of experiences and losses and choices, accumulated over decades, produced the man who drinks alone at his workbench and says wubba lubba dub dub and means, I am in great pain. Morty has been accumulating experiences for 7 seasons. He is 14. He has decades left. And the most chilling secret the show keeps about Morty's transformation is not what he has already become. It is that the person best positioned to see where he is headed, the only person who has lived this trajectory from the beginning, is Rick. And Rick keeps bringing him along anyway. __quote_7__. Which raises a question that connects directly to the secret the show is keeping about Rick's stated worldview, and the one character in the family who has always understood it more clearly than anyone else gives her credit for. Section 9. Jerry is the only character the show lets be happy, and that's the point. There is a moment at the end of Season 2 that the show delivers without any fanfare whatsoever. Rick has just attempted to kill himself. Not dramatically, not as a plot point the episode builds toward or resolves. He sits alone at his workbench after Unity leaves, prepares what is clearly meant to end his life, and then passes out from drinking before he can go through with it. The camera holds on him for a moment, slumped, unconscious, alone in the garage, and then the scene cuts. It cuts to Jerry, outside, in the yard, looking for his weed whacker. He finds it, and he is genuinely, simply, completely happy about this. Not performing happiness, not settling for it, actually happy, in the way a person is happy when something small goes right on an ordinary afternoon. He found the thing he was looking for. The day is fine. Life is fine. Dan Harmon, the show's co-creator, talked about this exact juxtaposition in 2017. He described Rick as intelligent and miserable, and Jerry as oblivious and content. And then he asked the question the show had been quietly asking since the pilot: does Jerry have it better? His answer was that he genuinely thought so. That is the secret this section is about. Not that Jerry is secretly capable or secretly smart or secretly more than the show lets him appear to be, though the show gives you evidence of all three across its run. The secret is simpler and more uncomfortable than any of those things. Jerry Smith, the character every other person in the show treats as a joke, as a burden, as the least impressive person in any room he enters, is the happiest character in Rick and Morty. And the show built him that way on purpose, as a direct and deliberate argument against everything Rick Sanchez represents. To understand what the show is doing with Jerry, you have to start with what Jerry actually is. Jerry is not a bad person. This is important and easy to miss because the show surrounds him with people who treat him as one. Rick openly despises him. Beth spent the first 3 seasons barely tolerating him. His children love him, but are acutely aware of his limitations and are not always kind about them. The world of the show, the interdimensional, cosmos-spanning, infinitely complex world that Rick moves through like a god, has no use for Jerry and no interest in pretending otherwise. The Ricks of the Citadel built a daycare for Jerry's. Not a daycare for Morty's, not a system for managing Beth's or Summer's, a daycare specifically for Jerry's. Because the universal consensus across the central finite curve is that every Jerry is incapable of surviving off Earth without supervision. The Jerry Baree is the show's most efficient piece of Jerry commentary. It exists because every Rick, independently, across infinite dimensions, arrived at the same conclusion. Jerry cannot handle the multiverse. He needs to be kept somewhere safe while the real people do the real things. The institution of the Jerry Baree, the fact that it was built, that it was necessary, that every Rick apparently agreed it was necessary, is the multiverse's collective verdict on Jerry Smith. And Jerry is fine with it. This is the part that the show uses to make its argument. Jerry does not rage against his assessment. He does not secretly harbor ambitions to prove everyone wrong. He does not nurse a wound about being the least impressive person in his family. When he is at the Jerry Baree with the other Jerrys, he plays with them. He enjoys it. He bonds with Doofus Rick, the one Rick in the central finite curve who apparently eats his own waste and is mocked mercilessly by every other Rick. Because Doofus Rick is kind to him, and Jerry responds to kindness with genuine warmth, and the resulting friendship is one of the most purely wholesome things the show has ever depicted. The Jerrys at the Jerry Baree have a functioning community. They have figured out how to enjoy themselves inside a situation that was designed to contain them. They are, by any observable measure, having a better time than most of the Ricks. Jerry's relationship with happiness is the show's quietest and most consistent argument. He finds it in things that Rick would never notice. In a weed whacker. In a Titanic-themed honeymoon that Beth finds embarrassing. In his Star Wars coin collection that he keeps secret because he knows the people around him would mock it. In beekeeping, which he picks up in Season 4 and pursues with a genuine enthusiasm that asks nothing of the universe in return. In the simple fact of being married to a woman he loves, even when that marriage is painful and complicated and on the verge of ending. Rick's relationship with happiness is the opposite. Rick has access to literally everything. He can go anywhere, build anything, become anyone. He has dismantled governments and outsmarted gods and traveled to dimensions that most beings in the central finite curve cannot imagine. And he is miserable. Not occasionally miserable. Not miserable in the way that smart people sometimes struggle with the weight of what they understand. Chronically, structurally, bone-deep miserable, in a way that the show has documented across every season, and that even Rick acknowledges in his most unguarded moments. The weed whacker scene is the show putting these two men side by side and asking which one you would rather be. It does not tell you the answer, it just holds the image. Rick, unconscious and alone in the dark, having just failed to end his life. Jerry, in the afternoon light, holding a garden tool, content, Season 3 gives Jerry his most significant arc, and the one that reveals the most about what the show is doing with him. When Beth chooses Rick over him at the start of the season and they divorce, Jerry moves into a motel. He is broke, alone, living in a small room, eating bad food, watching his marriage dissolve and his family restructure around a man who has always treated him as an obstacle. By any external measure, this is rock bottom. This is the worst Jerry's life has ever been. The show does not play it as rock bottom. It plays it as clarifying. Jerry without Rick's shadow over everything, without the constant comparison, without the daily reminder of his own inadequacy sitting in his garage and burping at him, turns out to be a person who can function, who makes choices, who eventually finds something like dignity in the stripped-down life he is living, even if it took losing everything to get there. The whirly-durly conspiracy gives Jerry and Rick their most honest conversation. Rick takes Jerry on a trip, partly as a peace offering, partly because Morty asked him to. Jerry, on this trip, gets manipulated into a conspiracy to kill Rick by an alien who promises to give Jerry his life back. Jerry goes along with it. The conspiracy fails, and then the two of them end up having the most direct exchange the show has ever given them. Rick tells Jerry exactly what he thinks of him. Jerry tells Rick exactly what Rick has done to his family. Both of them are right. Both of them are also, in different ways, responsible for the damage they are describing. What the scene reveals about Jerry is that he knows. He is not as oblivious as everyone around him assumes. He knows that Rick considers him worthless. He knows that Beth's relationship with Rick has cost their marriage more than any fight they have ever had. He knows that his children see his limitations clearly. He carries all of this knowledge and he does not let it destroy him. He keeps showing up. He keeps trying to be present for his family, even when his family makes clear that his presence is not the presence they most want. That persistence, the willingness to keep showing up for people who do not always make it easy to show up for them, is not stupidity. It is a form of love that the show treats, slowly and across many seasons, as genuinely valuable. Not glamorous, not impressive by Rick's standards or anyone else's, but real and consistent in a way that Rick's love, for all its depth, has never been able to be. Rick leaves. Rick has always left. He left Beth when she was a teenager. He leaves Morty constantly, in large ways and small ones. He left the Citadel. He left the Resistance. He left his original dimension. Leaving is Rick's primary response to anything that costs him more than he wants to pay. Rick is extraordinary in every way except staying. Jerry stays. Jerry has always stayed. When the Earth was taken over by the Galactic Federation and Rick was in prison and everything was objectively terrible, Jerry found the one thing about the situation that worked for him. The Federation gave him a job, gave him a sense of purpose, gave him the simple satisfaction of being useful, and he was content. The rest of his family was miserable. Jerry was fine. Not because he was not paying attention, but because his capacity to find something workable in a bad situation is genuine and deep, and does not require the world to be a certain way before it activates. The show also, across its run, establishes that Jerry is not as incapable as the Jerry Baree suggests. In Rick Potion number 9, when the Cronenberg disaster hits and the world falls apart, Jerry protects Beth and Summer. He acts. He does not freeze. He does not wait for Rick to come back and fix it. He kills to keep his family safe, and he does it without the benefit of portal guns or alien technology or genius-level intelligence. He has his hands and his love for the people in front of him, and that is what he uses. In Season 6, the show begins to give Jerry a quiet arc of his own. He becomes slightly more capable, slightly more present, slightly more the person he has always been capable of being without Rick around to confirm his worst beliefs about himself. The comparison to Rick, which has been crushing Jerry since the first episode, gradually loses some of its power over him. He starts making choices that feel like his rather than reactions to everyone else's choices. Dan Harmon's observation about the weed whacker is the key to all of it. Jerry's happiness is not something the show presents as an accident or a character flaw, or a symptom of not understanding the world clearly enough. It is presented as the thing Rick cannot have. The one thing all of Rick's intelligence and capability and interdimensional access cannot produce. The simple ability to find the afternoon good. Rick builds universes inside batteries. He engineers new life forms. He has defeated gods and governments and the most powerful organizations in the central finite curve. He cannot sit in a yard and feel okay about the day. Jerry found his weed whacker. Life is fine. The show does not tell you Jerry is the wisest character in Rick and Morty. It does not make that case loudly or directly. It just keeps placing him next to Rick in these quiet moments and letting the contrast do the work. And the contrast across 7 seasons accumulates into something that functions like a thesis. Intelligence is not the same as happiness. Power is not the same as peace. And the man the multiverse built a daycare to contain might be living better than the man the multiverse was built around. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There is one more character who understood this dynamic long before the audience did. Someone who watched Rick and Jerry both from close range for years, who absorbed what each of them represented, and who has been quietly carrying a secret about what she sees that the show has never fully surfaced. And that character's secret, the one hiding in plain sight across every season, connects directly back to everything the series has been building toward from the very beginning. Section 10. The secret the writers planted and said they would never confirm. There is a secret about the show that only a small group of people know. Not a theory, not a fan interpretation. An actual, deliberate secret. Something the writers decided on early in the show's production. Something they agreed they would never state out loud. Something they embedded in the show through clues and hints and carefully placed details across the entire run. A secret about the world of Rick and Morty that was always meant to be there, underneath everything, shaping how the show was built even if the audience could never confirm it directly. Justin Roiland talked about this in 2015, during a Reddit session where he and Dan Harmon took questions from fans. Someone asked about the deeper mythology of the show, about whether there were things going on beneath the surface that viewers were not being told. Roiland confirmed it. He said that early in production, the creative team agreed on a secret about the show's world. Something they would keep to themselves. Something they would never explicitly reveal during the run of Rick and Morty. But something they would place clues toward, scattered across episodes, for the audience to find if they were paying close enough attention. Then, Roiland said something that made the whole thing more interesting. He acknowledged that a fan on Reddit had already figured it out. Someone, going through the episodes carefully and putting pieces together, had arrived at the correct answer and posted it. Roiland confirmed the fan was right. And then, keeping his word about never stating it directly, he said nothing else. He did not name the fan. He did not identify the post. He did not confirm which theory it was. He simply said, "Someone got it," and then he moved on. What followed was years of the Rick and Morty fandom doing what it does best, going through every available piece of evidence, mapping the timing of Roiland's response against the Reddit posts that existed at that time, narrowing the field down based on what was possible versus what the show had already contradicted. The process was methodical in the way that genuinely invested fan communities can be methodical. And it eventually narrowed to 2 candidates. 2 theories that fit the available evidence, that matched the timing of Roiland's acknowledgement, and that were coherent enough to have been something the writers actually built around. The first theory is that Rick is an older version of Morty. The second theory is that Rick knows he is a fictional character. Both of these theories have textual support in the show. Both of them change the meaning of large portions of what the series depicts, and both of them have been treated seriously enough by people close to the show that neither one can be dismissed as pure speculation. Start with the first one. Rick is an older version of Morty. The show plants this possibility carefully and never confirms it. The visual design of the 2 characters has always contained a quiet parallel. They share certain features, certain proportions, a certain quality to their expressions in specific moments that is easy to attribute to animation style. and harder to attribute to animation style once you are looking for it deliberately. The show has, across its run, established that the multiverse allows for versions of people to exist in wildly different circumstances, that the same genetic material can produce radically different outcomes depending on what that person experiences. Rick C137, as this section has already established, is not the Rick who originally belonged to the Smith family. He moved through the multiverse for decades before settling in Rick Prime's home dimension. He was, at some point, a younger man, a man before the portal gun, before the vengeance quest, before decades of loss and violence and the accumulation of everything that made him what he is now. The show has shown Rick as a young man in flashbacks and memory sequences. What that younger Rick looked like structurally has certain things in common with what Morty looks like now. The theory does not require that Rick C137 is literally Morty Prime grown old. It allows for the possibility that across some dimension, in some configuration of the multiverse, there is a Morty who lived long enough and hard enough and lost enough to become something recognizable as Rick. The show's entire premise, that Mortys and Ricks exist in a specific ratio across dimensions, that they are genetically and neurologically linked, that the relationship between them is not accidental but designed, creates the conditions for this reading without ever stating it. What it would mean for the show if true is staggering. Every time Rick is cruel to Morty, he would be doing something to a version of himself. Every time he comes back, every time he chooses the relationship over leaving, every time he does the thing the show keeps documenting of caring more than he admits, he would be doing it for himself as much as for Morty. The entire dynamic between them would carry a weight that the show never names, but that would explain, underneath everything, why their bond is so specific and so impossible to fully break. It would also explain Rick's particular investment in Morty's development, his monitoring of Morty's choices, his frustration when Morty makes mistakes that Rick knows the cost of, his pride, buried and rarely surfaced, when Morty does something that works. A man watching a younger version of himself navigate the beginning of a journey he already knows the end of would behave exactly the way Rick behaves. Hovering, critical, unable to look away, unable to fully intervene. The second theory is different in character, but equally supported. Rick knows he is a fictional character. The show has given Rick fourth wall breaks across its run. Moments where he addresses the camera directly. Moments where he references the audience, references the episode format, references the nature of the show itself as a show. These moments are usually played quickly, as jokes, as the kind of meta-humor that animated series use to signal their own self-awareness. The show is smart, and it knows it is smart, and it sometimes winks about that. But there is a specific piece of canon that gives the fourth wall breaks a different meaning. In Rick and Morty comic issue 57, Rick takes Morty to an alternate dimension where they are a television show. In that dimension, Rick and Morty are not real. They are animated characters watched by an audience. The comic establishes that this is when Rick first learned that in another reality, his entire existence is entertainment. That somewhere outside his dimension, people watch his life. If this is canon, and the show treats its comics with varying degrees of seriousness, though this particular detail has not been contradicted, then every time Rick breaks the fourth wall in the show, he is not simply being meta. He is communicating with the dimension he knows is watching. He learned the truth about his situation on a visit to an alternate reality, and since then, when he speaks to the camera, he is speaking to a specific audience he knows is there. This changes the fourth wall breaks from jokes into something else entirely, into a man acknowledging, in the only way available to him, that he is aware his life is being watched, that the things he goes through, the loss, the violence, the relationships, the grief dressed up as nihilism, are playing out in front of people in a reality he can never reach. What that would feel like, for someone with Rick's intelligence and Rick's particular relationship to powerlessness, is something the show has never needed to state directly, because the behavior that knowledge would produce is exactly the behavior Rick already displays. The performance of not caring, the awareness of how he is being perceived, the occasional moment where he seems to be playing to something beyond the people in the room with him. Both theories, Rick as an older Morty, Rick as a man who knows he is fictional, share a common thread. They are both secrets about Rick's relationship to his own identity, about whether he knows something about himself that no one around him knows, about whether the performance of being Rick Sanchez, brilliant, nihilistic, untouchable, is a performance in a more literal sense than the show usually implies. Roiland confirms someone got it right. The confirmation happened in 2015, which means the correct theory existed in the fandom by 2015, only 2 seasons into the show's run. Someone was paying close enough attention to the first 2 seasons to arrive at a truth the writers had agreed to keep. The show has continued adding evidence since then, evidence that could support either theory or both simultaneously. The Season 5 finale's deep dive into Rick's memories. The Season 6 premiere's dimensional reset that reveals where everyone truly originates. The Season 7 moments that establish Rick Prime's relationship to the Morty he abandoned. All of it adds texture to a show that was always carrying more underneath it than it announced. What makes this secret different from the other secrets in this video is that it is the only one the show has never resolved. Every other secret in this essay, Rick's true origin, Morty's identity, Beth's childhood, the central finite curve, has been addressed directly by the show at some point. Stated, depicted, confirmed through canon events. This one has not. This one is still sitting where Roiland placed it in 2015, somewhere in the show, in the episodes, in the details, waiting. The writers kept their word. They never stated it directly. They kept placing clues. And the show continued for 7 seasons, adding layer upon layer to a story that was always built on top of something it was never going to name out loud. Which makes it, in a specific and quiet way, the most honest thing about the show. Because Rick and Morty has always been a series about the things people carry underneath what they are willing to say. About the gap between stated beliefs and actual behavior. About love that cannot announce itself, and grief that hides inside humor, and pain that comes out as a catchphrase. The writers put a secret in their show and refused to confirm it for a decade. Their characters do the same thing in every episode. The show and its creators are, in this specific way, identical to the man at the center of it. Brilliant, guarded, leaving clues for anyone paying close enough attention and never quite willing to say the thing directly. The fan who figured it out in 2015 is somewhere in the fandom right now, watching Season 7, still the only person outside the writer's room who knows for certain which answer is correct. And the show keeps going, carrying its secret the way Rick carries everything, out loud and invisible at the same time. __quote_9___. The second to last character secret in this story belongs to the person in the Smith family who has been most consistently underestimated. Not by Rick. Rick has been watching her more carefully than he lets on. But by the audience, by most analysis of the show, and by the other characters around her. Her secret is not about what she hides from everyone else. It is about what she sees that no one realizes she is seeing. Section 11. Summer Smith is the character who actually understands Rick, and Rick knows it. There is a scene in Season 1 that most people remember as a moment about Morty, Rick's Minutes. The episode where Rick hooks the family TV up to interdimensional cable, and the family starts watching alternate versions of their own lives through a pair of goggles. Beth and Jerry find a version of themselves where they never got pregnant, never got married, and both went on to have the lives they might have had. Beth became a respected surgeon. Jerry became a famous actor. They sit together, watching these other versions of themselves living fuller, freer, more successful lives, and they have to decide what that means for the lives they actually have. Morty finds Summer outside, sitting on the porch, ready to run. She has seen what she was not supposed to see. The alternate timeline where Beth and Jerry did not have her, did not have Morty, and were objectively better off for it. She has done the math that no child should have to do, and arrived at the conclusion that she was a mistake. That her existence cost her parents the lives they deserved. that the family she grew up in only exists because of an accident, and that without that accident, everyone involved would have been happier. She is about to leave. She has her bag. She has already decided. Morty stops her. Not with comfort, not with reassurance, not with the kind of thing an older sibling or a parent would say. He takes her out to the backyard and shows her the grave. His grave. His real body, from his real dimension, buried under the grass of a house that is not technically theirs. He tells her what happened, that he already lost his original world, that he already made peace with the fact that the family he has now is not the family he started with, and that he chose to stay in it anyway. He tells her that nobody exists on purpose, nobody belongs anywhere, and that they might as well watch TV. It lands as a joke. The show plays it that way, with the delivery and the cut back inside. But what Morty gave Summer in that moment was something real. The information that existence does not require justification. That you do not have to have been intended to have value. That the accident of being here is not a reason to leave. Summer does not run. She goes back inside. That scene is almost always discussed in terms of what it reveals about Morty, about how much he has processed, how far he has come, the grave, the secret. Summer's side of the scene gets less attention, which is exactly the pattern this entire section is about. Summer's side of everything gets less attention, including from the audience. And that pattern of under-attention has allowed one of the show's most significant character secrets to sit in plain sight for 7 seasons without being fully named. Summer Smith understands Rick Sanchez. Not partially, not in the way that family members develop a working understanding of a difficult person over time. She understands him in the specific, clear-eyed way that requires both intelligence and the willingness to look at something uncomfortable without flinching. She sees what Rick is, what he does, why he does it, and what it costs. She has been seeing this for the entire run of the show, and Rick, who misses almost nothing, knows that she sees it. Start with the intelligence. Summer is consistently treated by the show, and by the characters in it, as the shallow one. The teenager who cares about social media and clothes and what her friends think of her. The one who initially refused to go on adventures because she found them stupid. The background family member. The one the show pulls into a plot when it needs a third perspective, but who does not have the analytical depth of Rick or the moral weight of Morty. This reading is wrong, and the show demonstrates it wrong repeatedly. In Rick C137, near the end of Season 1, Summer understands Rick's vague description of a piece of equipment faster than Morty does. Morty has been going on adventures with Rick for the entire season at this point. Summer has not. She just listens to what Rick says and processes it more quickly. The show does not make a big moment out of this. It just happens. Rick gives a description, Morty is still working through it, Summer has already arrived at the answer. This happens again in subsequent seasons. Summer communicates with Rick in a register that Morty sometimes cannot reach. Not because she is more experienced, Morty's experience far outpaces hers for most of the show, but because the way Summer's mind works has a compatibility with Rick's that the show never announces but keeps demonstrating. She follows his logic faster. She tolerates his ambiguity better. She does not need the same amount of explanation that Morty needs before she can act on information. Rick notices this. The shift in how he treats Summer across the seasons is gradual but consistent. In Season 1, she is peripheral. Rick keeps her at a distance, involves her minimally, treats her as the family member least relevant to his purposes. By Season 2, he is including her on missions. By later seasons, he is giving her responsibilities in serious situations that he would not have trusted her with in the beginning. The expansion of Summer's role in Rick's operations is not the show simply giving a supporting character more screen time. It is Rick recognizing a capability he initially overlooked and adjusting accordingly. This is exactly how Rick treats things he respects. He does not announce the respect. He just stops treating the thing as unimportant. The moment that most clearly establishes Summer's understanding of Rick is in The Rickshank Redemption, the Season 3 premiere. Rick is in a Federation prison. The family is scattered. Summer's response to the situation is not panic, and it is not passivity. She digs up the dead Rick from the Cronenberg dimension, the body buried in the backyard, and uses his portal gun, knowing it will be flagged by the Citadel and knowing that flagging it will set events in motion. She is not doing this blindly. She is doing it because she understands how Rick thinks well enough to know that creating a signal is the right move. That Rick, wherever he is, will use whatever opening the signal creates. She is right. The events of the episode, Rick's escape, the collapse of the Federation, the destruction of the Citadel's council, are set in motion partly by Summer's decision in that garage. She does not have Rick's intelligence or his technology or his decades of experience. She has her understanding of how he operates, and in that specific moment, that understanding is enough. Morty's response to the same situation, Rick being gone, the family adrift, is to want to go get him, to want direct action, direct contact, direct solution. Summer's response is to think about what Rick would do, to work within the logic of Rick's world rather than against it, and to make a move that Rick himself would have made. That is not the response of someone who is simply fond of her grandfather. It is the response of someone who has spent years watching him closely enough to have internalized his patterns. There is also what Summer carries that Morty does not. Morty carries the weight of the Cronenberg disaster, of the body in the backyard, of every traumatic adventure that has left a mark. Summer carries something different, the knowledge of the alternate timeline. The goggles showed her the version of her parents' lives that did not include her, and she has had to integrate that knowledge into her ongoing existence in a way that has no clean resolution. There is no version of that knowledge that becomes comfortable. You either leave or you stay, and she stayed, and staying requires making peace with what the goggles showed. The way Summer made peace with it connects directly to how she understands Rick. Rick also knows things about the world that make continuing to function a genuine challenge. He knows the multiverse is infinite, and that his choices are therefore both everywhere and nowhere. He knows that in some dimensions every good thing happened, and in others it did not, and that the versions of himself who lost more than he has are also real. He carries this knowledge and keeps moving, because stopping is not an available option for Rick. Not psychologically, not practically. The momentum is the only thing keeping the whole structure from collapsing. Summer, after the goggles, does the same thing. She keeps moving. She goes back inside. She does not resolve the knowledge, she just decides it is not going to stop her. That decision, choosing forward motion over the paralysis of what you cannot change, is Rick's primary coping mechanism, and Summer adopted it independently, under pressure, at 17. Rick sees this. He does not say it directly, because Rick does not say most of what he observes. But his treatment of Summer in the seasons following Rick's minutes reflects someone who has taken notice of a person who handled something difficult in a recognizable way. The show also gives Summer and Rick a specific dynamic that is different from Rick's dynamic with anyone else in the family. With Morty, there is guilt underneath the relationship. The utility secret, the camouflage function, the awareness on Rick's part that the foundation of their bond was not innocent. With Beth, there is grief. The real Beth is dead, and this Beth is someone Rick chose to love in her place, which carries its own complicated weight. With Jerry, there is contempt that the show slowly softens but never fully resolves. With Summer, there is something cleaner, something closer to simple respect, growing across seasons into something that functions like genuine regard. Summer did not come with the history that the others came with. She was not part of Rick's plan. She is not a cloaking device or a substitute daughter or a reminder of what he lost. She is just a person who turned out to be more than he expected, and Rick, for all his faults, has always responded to that. The show confirms something about Summer in how it used her across the series that it never fully stated in dialogue. When Rick needs someone to act rather than be managed, he increasingly turns to her. When he needs someone who will understand a situation without a complete explanation, she is the one who gets the incomplete explanation. When the show wants to show Rick responding to genuine capability with genuine trust, Summer is the person that trust gets extended to. She started as the background sister, the one who thought the adventures were stupid and stayed home, the one the audience, like Rick, initially filed away as peripheral. And then she kept showing up, in the garage, on the missions, at the moments that mattered. Not because the show needed a third character in the scene, because Summer kept choosing to be present, kept processing what she saw clearly rather than emotionally, and kept demonstrating to the one person in the house who notices things that she was paying close attention. Rick noticed. He adjusted. And across 7 seasons, without any speech or announcement or formal moment of recognition, the relationship between the grandfather, who does not stay, and the granddaughter, who is never supposed to be part of the plan, became one of the most quietly functional relationships in the entire show. Summer understands Rick. Not completely. Nobody understands Rick completely, possibly including Rick himself. But she understands him in the ways that count. In the ways that keep you in the room when every reasonable instinct says to leave. In the ways that let you build something real with a person who is also, structurally, a disaster. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Which brings the story to the last and oldest secret. The one that predates every adventure, every invention, every version of Rick that the show has depicted. The man who made Rick C137 into what he is. The man whose indifference created the whole chain of events that the last 11 sections have been tracing. The man the show spent 7 seasons building toward, and who turned out to be, in the most specific and devastating way, the answer to the question the series was always asking about what Rick Sanchez would look like if the pain had never happened at all. Section 12. Rick Prime. The man who made Rick C137 into a monster. There is a version of Rick Sanchez who feels nothing. Not the performance of feeling nothing, not the armor that Rick C137 built over decades of loss and grief and violence, not the nihilism that Bird Person translated as a cry for help, not the detachment that Dr. Wong identified as a survival mechanism, not the coldness that cracks in quiet moments when Rick thinks nobody is watching. The actual thing. A Rick Sanchez who looked at his wife, his daughter, the family he had built, and felt genuinely, completely nothing. Not cruelty toward them, not resentment, nothing. The same way you feel nothing toward a stranger on a street in a city you are passing through. They exist, you continue. That Rick is Rick Prime, and he is the most important character in the entire series. Not because he is the most present. Rick Prime barely appears in the show across its first 5 seasons. He is a shadow, a reference, a face and a memory that Rick C137 has been carrying for decades. He is the reason the show exists in the shape it exists. Every character, every relationship, every secret this video has traced across 12 sections leads back to him. He is the first cause of everything. And when the show finally gives him real screen time in seasons 6 and 7, what he reveals about the show's central argument is more complete and more devastating than anything the series had produced before. To understand Rick Prime, you have to start with the moment the show confirms as the beginning of everything. Rick C137 was a different person before Rick Prime came to his garage. This is the detail the show establishes in the Season 5 finale and confirms in the Season 6 premiere, and it is the detail that changes how you read every version of Rick C137 the show has ever depicted. The man who drinks at his workbench and performs not caring was not always that man. There was a version of him who chose his family over the multiverse, who looked at what Rick Prime was offering, infinite dimensions, infinite discovery, the freedom to go anywhere and be anything, and said no. Not because he was afraid, because he had Diane, and he had Beth, and the life in front of him felt like enough. Rick Prime found this offensive. The show does not give Rick Prime a complicated motivation for what he did. It does not reveal a history of rivalry, a philosophical disagreement that escalated, a wound that Rick C137 accidentally inflicted that Rick Prime was responding to. Rick Prime came back to Rick C137's garage with a bomb because Rick C137's choice to stay with his family represented something Rick Prime could not tolerate. The existence of a version of himself who valued people over science, who chose love over the infinite, who was content with a life that Rick Prime would have considered beneath him. That existence was, to Rick Prime, an insult. So he ended it. He planted the bomb. Diane died. Beth died. The real Beth, the child, Rick C137's actual daughter. And Rick Prime left. Not in a hurry, not in the panic of someone who had done something they knew was wrong and needed to escape the consequences. He left the way you leave a place that no longer interests you, calmly, with nothing following him because nothing in him required processing. This is the detail the show returns to repeatedly across seasons 6 and 7, and it is the most important thing the series has ever established about the difference between Rick C137 and Rick Prime. Rick C137, after losing his family, fell apart. He spent decades hunting the man who did it. He killed versions of himself across the multiverse, accumulated enemies, built institutions he then abandoned, drank himself into daily unconsciousness, and eventually settled in a dead man's house with a dead man's family because it was the closest thing he could find to what he lost. His grief was total and visible, and it shaped everything he became. Rick Prime had no grief. There was nothing to process because nothing in him had been damaged by what he did. He went back to exploring the multiverse. He did whatever he wanted, on whatever timeline suited him, with no agenda the show can identify and no relationships the show can confirm. He simply existed, freely and completely on his own terms, in the way that Rick C137 has always performed existing, without ever actually being able to do it. When the show finally brings Rick Prime into direct contact with Rick C137, the contrast is the argument. Rick C137 has spent decades becoming harder, building armor over the wound, developing the persona, the genius, the nihilist, the man who needs nothing, as a way of surviving something that should not have been survivable. Every terrible thing Rick C137 has ever done, every relationship he has damaged, every moment where his behavior has been genuinely cruel rather than just thoughtless, all of it is the product of what happened in that garage. The bomb did not just kill Diane and Beth, it began the process of turning Rick C137 into a version of Rick Prime. Not the same version, a version made from pain rather than from indifference, but heading in the same direction. Rick Prime, standing in front of him in Season 7, is what Rick C137 has been pretending to be for decades. And Rick Prime makes clear, in how he operates, that the pretending was never the real thing. He calls Rick C137 Wife Guy. Dead Wife Rick. These names are not cruelty in the way that Rick C137's cruelty operates. Pointed, specific, aimed at a wound the speaker knows is there. They are dismissal. The names say, the thing that defined your entire existence, the loss that made you what you are, the grief you have been carrying across dimensions for decades. I find it trivially small. I find it so uninteresting that I reduced it to a label. You built your whole identity around losing Diane, and I cannot even be bothered to find that tragic. This is the most devastating thing the show has ever had one character say to another. Not because the words are particularly cutting, because Rick Prime means them. He is not performing contempt. He genuinely does not understand why the loss of a wife and daughter would reorganize a person's entire existence. He does not have the capacity to understand it. And his lack of understanding is not a wound in him. It is not something he struggles with or something the show reveals he secretly suffers from in private. It is simply an absence, a place where something should be and is not. The show confirms this through Rick Prime's relationship with the family he abandoned in the Prime dimension. Beth Prime, the daughter Rick Prime raised, the one who grew up with Rick Prime as her father before he eventually left, is mentioned in the show's later seasons in a specific context. Rick Prime, encountering someone he initially believes is his original Morty, reacts with something. Not warmth, not love, but something. A flicker of something the show allows you to clock before Rick Prime processes who he is actually talking to, and the flicker disappears. The show uses this moment precisely because it is the only moment in Rick Prime's entire depicted existence where something other than pure indifference crosses his face. It is gone almost immediately, but it was there. What that flicker means for Rick Prime's characterization is the most interesting question the show raises about him and never fully answers. Is it residual feeling? Something that survived the decades despite Rick Prime's complete indifference to everything? Is it a learned response? A pattern that got built into him during the years he was present in Beth's life before he left? Or is it something the show is suggesting about the limits of even Rick Prime's emptiness? That even the most extreme version of Rick Sanchez, the version with no grief and no love and no need for anyone, retains some tiny trace of the thing Rick C137 chose his family over. The show does not answer this. It places the flicker and moves forward. What it does answer, definitively, is why Rick Prime matters to the show's central question. The show has always been asking what it costs to be Rick Sanchez, what the intelligence costs, what the freedom costs, what the nihilism costs. Rick C137's answer to this question is visible in every episode. It costs everything. The wife, the daughter, the decades, the capacity for ordinary happiness, the ability to stay anywhere without eventually finding a reason to leave. Rick C137 paid all of it. The pain made him extraordinary, and it made him miserable, and it made him the specific, broken, brilliant person that the Smith family got when he crashed his ship into their garage. Rick Prime's answer to the same question is different. Rick Prime did not pay anything. He did not lose his happiness to his intelligence. He simply did not have the kind of happiness that could be lost. He did not sacrifice warmth for the freedom of the multiverse. He began without warmth. He is what Rick C137 would be if the loss had never happened and the love had never existed. He is the pure form, the original shape, the Rick Sanchez who was never modified by grief. And he is, by any measure, worse. Not more dangerous, not more powerful. Worse. As a person, as a being moving through the world. Rick C137, for all his damage, chose to stay with a family that was not his, built a robot to make a boy feel loved, came back when he could have left, kept choosing the relationship even when every reasonable instinct built from pain said to abandon it. Rick C137 is broken in ways that make him difficult and sometimes genuinely terrible. He is also capable of love in ways that Rick Prime is not, and the show has spent 7 seasons making the case that the capacity for love, even damaged love, even love that expresses itself badly and inconsistently, is what separates a life from an existence. Rick Prime exists. Rick C137 lives. The distinction is everything. The Season 7 episode Unmortrican brings Rick C137 and Morty Prime to Rick Prime, and what follows is the conclusion of the arc that began with a bomb in a garage. Rick Prime dies in that episode. The show does not give his death the weight of a grand finale. It is not a climactic battle, not a moment of dramatic reckoning drawn out across the runtime. Rick Prime dies, and the episode continues, and the hunt that defined Rick C137's existence for decades is simply over. What Rick C137 feels in the aftermath is something the show depicts with characteristic restraint. Not triumph, not peace, not the closure that revenge stories traditionally promise their protagonists. Something quieter and more honest. The specific emptiness that follows the end of a mission that has been the organizing principle of your life for longer than you can clearly remember. Rick C137 spent decades becoming the kind of person who could find and kill Rick Prime. He built everything around that purpose. And now the purpose is gone, and what is left is the man underneath it. The man who once chose Diane over the multiverse, worn down to almost nothing by everything that choice eventually cost him. The show does not tell you what Rick does with that emptiness. It leaves the question open in the way that Rick and Morty leaves most of its most important questions. Not unresolved, but trusted to the audience. What do you do when the thing that made you who you are no longer exists? When the wound that shaped you has been addressed, however violently, however incompletely, and the shaping remains, but the wound is finally closed. Rick C137 still has the Smith family, still has Morty Prime, the grandson of the man he just killed, still has Beth, who never knew her real father and has been living with his replacement for the entire run of the show, still has the garage, the workbench, the portal gun, the endless multiverse of things to do and places to go and problems to solve, and still has the original question, the one Rick Prime answered one way and Rick C137 has been answering differently across 7 seasons. In every moment he chose to stay when leaving was easier. The question is whether any of it matters. Whether the people you love and the connections you build and the family you stumble into by accident and choose to stay with anyway, whether all of that adds up to something worth the cost. Rick Prime's answer was no. He decided before the experiment was complete, burned down someone else's version of it to prove his point, and spent the rest of his existence proving he was right by feeling nothing about anything. Rick C137's answer is still being written. And it lives in every section of this video. In the grave in the backyard, in the weed whacker in the afternoon light, in the toy box full of weapons, in the robot built to make a boy feel loved, in the catchphrase that means "I am in great pain," in the family that was never his and that he chose anyway, over and over, in every small and unremarkable way that the show has always known matters more than anything extraordinary. The show is not finished making its case, but across 12 sections, across every secret it has carried and partially revealed and trusted its audience to hold, the case is already clear. Rick Prime is what happens when nothing costs you anything. And the show, from its very first episode to wherever it eventually ends, has been asking you to decide which version of that would you rather be. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.